I see many faces recognized from the front rows of our main stage. We now have 75 minutes to take some of these topics and address them in a little more depth. And I'm thrilled that as part of our Urban Alliance conversation, we can really look with a greater fine-tooth comb, perhaps, at what really works. What works for transatlantic cities in partnership, what works for transatlantic cities as individuals, where exchange is useful, and where we together can make progress. So I'm thrilled to introduce our panel and our work together to you. Elisabeth Mansfeld from the Alfred Herrhausen Foundation and Neil Brown from the Progressive Policy Institute. And they're going to tell us a little bit more about their investment in this and how they see the future of this program.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Cathryn, being here with us and moderating the main panel before and being here now for the moderation. So thank you to you. And a big thank you to see all of our fellows, mainly coming from US. You had a long flight, and to the fellows here. And it's a pleasure now to be here, and it's the concluding presentation of our fellowship, which we had for 3 years now. And we built an alliance, and we're talking today about alliances. We built 3 years ago, the partners PPI, DPZ, and Alfred Herrhausen Gesellschaft become an alliance to strengthen transatlantic dialogue. And we launched this project, the New Urban Progress Transatlantic Dialogue on the Future of Work, Democracy, and Well-being. If you look at today, after 3 years, the world has changed. 2 years of COVID, war in Ukraine, the urgency and the increase of climate shocks. And among these extreme external shocks, we experiment polarized and socially disbalanced society. So the more the world appears fragmented and complex, we need safety and orientation, which alliances provide. And the AHG, the Alfred Herrhausen Gesellschaft, started already in 2004 to investigate in cities. And this year we celebrate as a society, the 30 years anniversary. And all these years, we always, like our partners from New Urban Progress, support the open dialogue, give room for reflection and foresight. So we enable a change of perspectives and encourage change makers. And alliances are most effective to realize that, to learn from each other. And like cities, New Urban Progress enabled the change of perspectives. And during our travels to US or to Germany in the last 2 years, we could build new alliances and look through the lens of the others. I strongly believe exchange and dialogue enables to explore innovative solutions and find rapid responses to our challenges. And this is exactly where, as well as cities, and not only our own alliance through New Urban Progress, have the power for change. And cities are these places where effects of any crisis are felt most, and in the same time, they are able to respond and develop innovative solutions. And as a core source for this democratic values and innovation, cities offer a new path for transatlantic dialogue. And that's what we wanted with New Urban Progress. And as Brian Hansen today mentioned in our panel just before, how can we use these collective conversations? And I'm excited to listen to this panel, and I pass over to Neil. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's so great to see these faces again that I've gotten to travel around the world with. I was fortunate enough to participate not only in organizing this, but actually participating in it. And thank you all for letting me do that. This project, you did a great job. I'm not going to go over it in the stuff. We started the project during the Trump years or just after. We're very concerned about the kind of deterioration potential thereof of the transatlantic relationship. And this was our attempt to try to mend things, look at what we could be doing better and right. And we have found a wonderful, talented, brilliant group of young people that are thinking deeply about this. And I can't wait to hear what they've got to say about this. And I'll just leave it at that. And thank you all for joining us. And Almut, I'm going to give this to you. No? Oh, okay, never mind.
So urban diplomacy is something that emerged, I think, in a more active and functional way over the past 30 years, but it began with this idea of parallel diplomacy, right? Para-diplomacy. Think of Quebec trying to argue with the Canadian state for more rights and more language and, you know, to pull its elbows out. And then there were the city sisters or sister cities that came together as pairings. And sometimes they weren't very strategic pairings. They were intended for cultural exchange. They were extended for some economic exchange, but not often really how cities made their bread and butter. And then there are some exceptions. And you're going to hear from two exceptions right now. And that is the city partnership between Hamburg, the free and Hanseatic city of Hamburg, and Chicago. They've been twinned as sister cities since 1994, and Almut Möller and I, who's effectively the diplomat of the city of Hamburg, but she has a much fancier title, plenipotentiary. I love that. So Almut, what Almut does, and I'll introduce her properly in just a moment, is she represents the city of Hamburg, of course, which is a city-state, not just to the second highest chamber here in Berlin, but she represents Hamburg's interest in Brussels. But she is effectively also the woman who stewards Hamburg's international interests in the world. So we'll hear from Almut in just a moment, and then we'll hear from her effective counterpart in Chicago about what their relationship means and links, and that transatlantic linkage means to them and means to the transatlantic relationship. So Almut Möller.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you so much, Cathryn, and congratulations really to the whole team behind the new urban progress agenda. I was really fortunate to be invited here and there as a member of a sounding board, giving some thoughts from sort of my perspective. And I remember when I was asked to do that about 3 years ago, I was literally transitioning from the world of ideas to the world of policy making at local level, because I'd spent 20 years in the world of analysis and think tanks, and I felt it's just about time to roll up sleeves and show whether any of that is really relevant in real life. And the journey that I've taken with that, the way that also the urban progress agenda has evolved, sort of triggered some thoughts in me, and I thought I share them with you, much looking forward to the conversation we're going to have thereafter, which is, I understand, the idea of this great conference. So I got some guiding questions from the organizers, and as I would go through them and start with the first one. The first one was, how do cities make the transatlantic partnership more resilient? And I thought, wait a minute, from my perspective, this question doesn't make so much sense. Yes, we care deeply about transatlantic relations. We've had a wonderful sister city partnership with Chicago. Colleagues from the police and fire brigades are just over in Chicago, signing letters of intent on expanding their joint agendas. I personally strongly believe in the value of transatlantic cooperation, but from a city perspective, I come in and ask myself, and I'm also in charge of international affairs, so my job is to try and understand, how do our international ties, our partnerships with other cities and regions in the world contribute to making life in the cities that we engage with and in Hamburg better? How can transatlantic relations go beyond the idea, if we look at the transatlantic agenda, that it is great to meet each other and to get to know each other, to a place where we say, yes, it's great to meet people and to make new friends, but it's even better to do great stuff with each other that is felt really in both cities very clearly. And those who are going to be part of the podium know much better and more granular ways what that means. We live in environments where we are solving problems all the time. Our cities are places where citizens engage with us. They put challenges to us and we have to solve problems. And whenever I found that you meet people that engage, as in the New Urban Progress context, people that are engaged in their respective environments and dealing with those questions, when you put them together in a room and they have a decent way of understanding and communicating through a language or some support with that, it works easily because they're problem solvers. And that, I think, is the beauty really of projects like this, where personally, me as a background of, you know, engaging in international affairs on a sort of broad level, the first step that we can, of course, people like myself can do is to help open up a conversation and a space and link people. But then I really asked myself in the second step, who are the people in our city that are actually the ones that I would like to interest in this conversation, because they come with an urban planning perspective. They deal with health issues, social divisions that deal with the questions of how do we, in particular in Europe right now, how do we make sure that our cities can look after those looking for shelter with a war of aggression that Russia has started against the sovereign state in the heart of Europe? And how can we really bundle and join forces to work together as cities? So my vision and idea for cities, well beyond, and there's many other examples other than Hamburg and Chicago, where do we find those examples where we discover that there's actually even more of a joint interest in collaborating, because we owe this to our citizens. Foreign affairs is nothing that can be taken for granted. It is something that has to deliver local communities. And I think this is something where cities can make a good contribution. So this was just a thought I wanted to put here, and just share one observation, because you also asked me, how can we improve these ways of collaborating? And the sister city partnerships, of course, are good once they are developed, I think, between Germany and the US or North America quite a bit. But what I think you want to look at is something a little bit different. It's looking at joint problem solving, joint policy making. And one observation I have, and Cathryn knows this because we've talked about this before, I'm also in charge of our European relationships, and I am a bit more specific, our European Union relationships with other cities. And here we can see that the framework that the European political system provides now for cities, with big budgets and projects, you know, with an increasingly open European Commission for cities and urban agendas, in particular with the green transition and, you know, questions of migration, we feel that the framework that the European Union has provided gives us a lot more incentives and a lot more entry points and resources to work collectively. And this is right now, in the situation that we see in Ukraine, a very good and a very useful one, because we have frameworks in place. There is organizations such as the Eurocities that collectively lobby our joint interests as European cities at EU level and try to influence EU policymaking. So I think for the transatlantic agenda between cities in Germany / we're embedded in the European Union, Europe, EU, Europe, and the US, is perhaps also to look at where we can work with bigger entities, umbrella organizations that can help at national levels or at EU levels or at UN levels shape urban agendas. And that, I know, is a very big thought, but I think if you really put it down to some very concrete areas and a joint agenda, that is not so difficult, because a lot of the questions we are dealing with are so obvious and don't differ between our places. And in the EU context, I see this becoming a real sort of dynamic environment. And that, again, is nothing that is happening because we feel we are contributing to Europeanization. This is my thinking from my own work, my old work. Yes, there's a value in that, a very strong value in that. But it is an abstract way of looking at it. The concrete way of looking at it is that we're working together, and through that, we have a solidarity of deeds and of changing lives locally. And that actually is what creates the spirit and strengthens our alliance. So this is just a couple of thoughts I wanted to put to you, and I'm looking forward to our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Almut. I think you've done such a perfect job of reiterating what we were discussing in our earlier conversation, is that, you know, cities have discovered their own interests. They've discovered their own power because they're very actively negotiating. And I can tell you, and this is not a secret, that the head of Eurocities, the mayor of the city of Florence, Mr. Nardella, is de facto meeting right now with the head of the European Commission. And just to, for those of you that don't work on cities every single day, I think it's important to think about how cities that are really at the forefront of a number of the issues that Imwood pointed out are trying to negotiate more resources for themselves, more power for themselves. And so if you look at the Visegrad 4 or the cities that are now embedded in, the global compact structure, they're trying to figure out, does the nation state always have to own the bag of resources and reallocate that to cities when cities are really at the front line? And I quibble a little bit with the Sustainable Development Goals. Goal 11 is the one on sustainable cities. And then when you go down the entire list of the Sustainable Development Goals, you ask yourself, what of these can actually be achieved without undergirding all of these goals with cities first? Meaning to say, this is kind of how I argued with my priest when I was confirmed about the structure of the 10 Commandments. I have the same issues in a way with the Sustainable Development Goals. I think cities are the heart, blood, and lifeblood because of everything that Imwood said. I now have the pleasure to introduce you to Imwood's counterpart in Chicago, who's going to be on screen. So Samir Mayekar, I hope I got that right. He's a deputy mayor for economic and neighborhood development in the city of Chicago. Like Imwood, and I think this is also important for our young urban entrepreneurs in the NUP program, he comes to city planning from a totally different background of entrepreneurship and had his own company. So let's see what his perspective is on the communal issues we're wanting to address.
Hi, I'm Julian Clayton. I am from New York City.
My name is Julia Dieringer. I work as an urban researcher for the German Institute.
The transatlantic partnership is really built on cities, and the reason for that is threefold. I think you have diplomatic connections between governments and between city leaders. You have trade connections with people who do business together. And you have, of course, cultural connections that last between cities. This is really emblematic, I think, of Chicago's sister city relationship, where we have sister cities all around the world. But I'll pick one, which is with Hamburg, where we have amazing connections with business, with people and cultural activities, and of course, with our sister city governments. And that relationship really is all about people. And that is what makes the transatlantic partnership so much stronger, is that we have people that interchange, that work with each other, and that helps us understand each other's culture and business environment in a deeper way, and ultimately really helps us address shared issues. There's so many times where we share best practices among cities, where there are items we can learn from our sister cities, and certainly in the transatlantic relationship, that's key. We were just in Paris earlier this summer exchanging ideas with Mayor Hidalgo. We were in London before that exchanging ideas with Mayor Khan. And that to me is really what the transatlantic relationship is all about. Now is really the time for cities in Germany and the US to strengthen their bonds. And why is that? When you think of the roots that we have economically in the US and in Germany, we share a common bond in manufacturing. This is a sector that I come from, and when you think about where our economies are headed, there's a significant amount of opportunity right now to onshore the manufacturing of products that might have been made in other parts of the world. And that supply chain risk and the need to mitigate that supply chain risk is an area that can really connect Germany and the United States, not just with traditional areas like the electrification of the vehicle supply chain, that's important to both countries, but also in new areas with advanced manufacturing that we can onshore, create more jobs, and stabilize that supply chain both in Europe and in the United States. There's no better time than a time of crisis to make sure that transatlantic leaders are connected. And I say this as a Marshall Fellow myself. I know how important that transatlantic relationship is. And ultimately, our people, our businesses have to truly understand each other, and that helps mitigate conflict and crises. So right now, given what's happening in Ukraine, and Kiev is the sister city of Chicago, it's the time for us to step up and help each other. And we've truly seen that with having refugees come here into Chicago, and we welcome them and we want them to be integrated in our society and have opportunity, but also to make sure that we're helping people abroad. And it's through that transatlantic bond that we truly understand each other and mitigate conflicts.
Session on how Chicago, Kiev, and Hamburg work with one another, because I didn't say, but since the beginning, almost just weeks into the war, Hamburg, that had traditionally had a relationship with St. Petersburg, took an interesting diplomatic step, is to change its views and then seek a very strong alliance with the city of Kiev. And I just came back from City Lab in Amsterdam, where exactly the needs of cities in Ukraine couldn't have been more obvious. We had the mayor of Lemberg, the mayor of Lviv on one of our calls, and 4 minutes into the broadcast, the power went down, because this was only on Monday. And that was, of course, when Russian missiles were hitting Ukrainian cities without mercy. 864 kindergartens destroyed. So how that is a strategic asset in a military conflict, I have no idea, frankly. But on to more productive things. I want to introduce you to some of the fellows that were a part of the new Urban Progress Fellowship Program. You've all understood now what its basic premise is. They have a number of things to say in reflecting on their time together and what they learned from the cities that they visited. So go ahead and roll tape.
Hi, I'm Julian Clayton. I am from New York City.
My name is Julia Dieringer. I work as an urban researcher for the German Institute of Urban Affairs.
My name is Zinaida Hakmak, and I am a PhD candidate at the Hertie School in Berlin.
My name is Ian Lundy. I am from California originally. I live and work in New York. My background is in real estate development, public-private partnerships.
My name's Grace. I am from Los Angeles originally. That's where I grew up. I had been working in Austin, Texas. I was working for an art center through the Parks and Recreation Department.
Yeah, my name is Alexander Shea. I'm a researcher conducting research at the interface of urban planning and mobility planning.
I'm Richard Lawrence Jr. I am a principal planner with the City of Alexandria, Virginia.
My name is Jamal Glenn. I am a venture capital investor. I work for a large impact investment firm.
My name's Mark. I'm with the German Consulate General in San Francisco, where I cover economic affairs.
New Urban Progress is a project on the future of cities and the future of the transatlantic partnership. For us, we had a 2-year program where we took city leaders from Germany and the United States. We brought them together, first digitally, and then we actually did 2 trips, one in Germany, one in the United States, where we saw 6 different cities, not just for fun, but to exchange the best practices on how cities can be more sustainable, how cities can be more innovative, and how cities can be more democratic. We needed to do this at this time because we saw that there was a weakening in the transatlantic relationship. And for us, it was crucial that we strengthen this long-standing bond between our leaders and citizens and everyone who takes part in a city. And our main goal really was to show that together at the city level, where most people are living, where the ideas are happening, where really progress is empirical and can really be felt by its citizens, that when these ideas are exchanged and replicated and actually then implemented across the cities in these 2 countries, Germany and United States, that we will see progress.
Inclusive growth and innovation is incredibly important for the transatlantic relationship because some of the most innovative and fastest growing cities are in the United States and Europe. And those cities don't always grow in a way where everyone gets to benefit from the growth.
The very important thing is actually to convince people also, on the state level and on the federal level, of the importance of cities where change actually takes place. You can create kind of the most beautiful visions and the most beautiful policies, but in the end, they need to be implemented.
Policies that impact the community should be informed by the people that they serve. And so getting that engagement and that buy-in and that input from the community to inform how cities develop policies and positions to serve those residents are key, so that we're properly connecting the dots from what the needs of the community are to what the resources that are being provided by the city.
Where we live, how we live is under threat, and we have to respond to that in a way that also doesn't replicate the mistakes of the past, where certain communities are left out of the solution and certain communities are neglected. So I really think, there's a larger existential threat, and then there's the ever-present strategy component of how do we respond without making problems that exist worse. So everything's at stake.
As cities become increasingly the leaders for change and the centers for democracy, they're playing a sort of larger role than maybe they did in the future, and are really becoming more global cities, that it's important to have those conversations not only with different actors in your own local community, but with actors abroad.
What makes this program unique, the New Urban Progress Fellowship, to not only look inside of cities, but also see them as players in the transatlantic relations.
They're the ideal places for change and progress because I always say cities are laboratories, right? They're experiments for how social and human interaction occur. I think it's a great place for urban innovation and progress because you're able to test policies on a large scale to see the impact on the quality of life for a lot of people.
When thinking about issues related to urban planning and urban progress, it's very easy to just be talking to the same people and just be in a very American perspective. So I'm really excited to talk with people from other cities in the US, but also from people outside of the US, and really get that German perspective and see what kind of new ideas they're thinking about, what challenges they're thinking about, see where the comparisons are, see where the differences are. One theme that we were really thinking about in our working group is actors working at the different levels, whether it's bottom up and people who are kind of working outside the system, like activists and people who have like their feet on the ground, versus the more formal structures and more formal actors, whether that's businesses or politicians.
I think the important thing about the New Urban Progress Fellowship, not only is this a really important conversation about cities as centers of economic development, but increasingly political development, but quite frankly, stitching together people from two sides of the Atlantic and building these relationships now that will flourish many years as the folks that are part of this fellowship continue to rise in their respective fields, in the public sector, in the private sector, or in government.
The New Urban Progress Project has been an amazing experience. Not only have I had the opportunity to meet and engage with people that are also working in cities, but they're not just individuals that are working for cities. They are donating to apps that are creating technology for cities. They are working in think tanks that are working for cities. So we all have these different perspectives that we're coming at together to address, how do we make our world more sustainable? How do we make it more equitable? How do we make it more innovative? And how do we make it more inclusive? And that's something that I can bring back to my community.
I was really excited to visit Leipzig, and I think one thing that surprised me most was how much I could draw a connection in a way to Austin, Texas, which is where I was working. I think it's a really interesting political dynamic in Leipzig that you have kind of this growing city that's sort of known for this local art movement that is seeing a lot of progressive change and a lot of young people moving there, but it's in a region that is more conservative and is also seeing a growth in the alt-right or the farther right political parties, and that's definitely true in Austin, Texas. You have kind of this blue city that's in sort of a red sea of Texas. And so it's interesting to see how they're thinking about change.
In terms of visions for cities, the city of Leipzig was actually a good example for how, you can create a vision for a city. And the interesting thing in Leipzig is that you actually need to, leave space, and to also stick to your plan, kind of be persistent on your zoning plan, on your urban development plan, even in times of decline, even if you have kind of high vacancy rates.
As we've seen, and not just in Chicago, but in a lot of American cities, there's a disparity between who benefits from growth. And oftentimes those who have kind of gone through the trenches of cities while they were in decline are the first to be dislocated once the cities start to rebound and thrive. And so as cities continue to grow and thrive, as we move forward, we want to make sure that those people that stuck through in the trenches can reap the benefits of that growth.
Cities should put the people at the forefront and really understand it's about the needs of the citizens and give them the chance to become part of the development of new ideas and also to implement those.
Topics that are most important for me as it relates to this fellowship is the systems that undergird every city, how different stakeholders come together to figure out how to make a city work. We have that dynamic in New York City. It's something that you constantly work at. It's something that you constantly strive to make it work. How do you get the rich to go along with the poor? How do you get the, people who are, much more invested in the private sector to agree with things from the public sector? These are some of the not battles, but some of the discussions that take place in my city. And I think that hearing how that happens in other cities, how they deal with the systems and the stakeholders and getting everyone involved and getting buy-in and, ultimately getting to outcomes that are beneficial to everyone that lives in the city and lives in the urban area. It's interesting. It would be interesting for me to hear.
As a local government practitioner, it's easy to focus on, okay, how are we going to solve our problems and what problems are uniquely ours? But as we not only travel through American cities, but go through German cities, we see that we share a lot of the same issues: housing affordability, immigration, climate resiliency. And so as we talk about best practices should be universal.
I think it's incredibly important for cities to be engaging with one another. I'll tell you, in many of the most recent years, I've grown real frustrated with the ability of nation states to be able to actually work together. We're seeing a little bit different approach, I think, now with respect to the Ukraine, but in so many instances, in climate change and in issues dealing with immigration, so hard for nation states to work with one another. I think it's easier for cities to work with one another because they're not caught up in a lot of the geopolitical politics that seem to capture nation states. And frankly, when you start talking city to city, you realize that the challenges being faced are so similar in ways that perhaps nation states don't share. So I think it's critical that cities talk to one another, both to learn from one another, to share with one another, to support one another. I think, frankly, that is the way of the future with respect to the world order.
So that's what makes democracy work, that's what makes our cities work, and that's what makes the transatlantic relationship between those cities work.
New Urban Progress redefined what transatlantic relations really is. We focus at the city level and on really sharing best practices between urban leaders in Germany and the United States. We really helped create a large network of leaders who are working across cities in the United States and in Germany so that we can not only talk about best practices, but create a network where these best practices could flow. And we really hope that our fellows will really go along this network and really in their everyday life, in their professional life, really start implementing these ideas. Because we know so much depends on it, whether it's making the city more democratic, sustainable, or innovative.
So much depends on it. Famous last words. All right. Well, so to take these issues a little further, let me welcome to the stage two of our new Urban Progress Fellows, Ian Lundy and Julian St. Patrick Clayton. I'll introduce them to you, but you've just met them plenty in this film. So both of them have very strong ties and connections to New York City, and I will, I'm sure, venture beyond that because you did just physically venture way beyond. But Ian is now a senior associate at M Squared, so they do impact fund. It's an impact fund focused on sustainable mixed income housing, and he comes at this perspective because he spent a lot of time at. I worked for the city of New York, so where we call it NYCHA, but it's the New York Housing Authority. And Julian St. Patrick Clayton is a deputy director for policy and research at the Center for NYC Neighborhoods, also New York City, with a background in the private sector, but he's had also roles at the state Senate and throughout city government. So welcome back to Berlin to the two of you, jet lag notwithstanding.
Dankeschön.
You know, I had some time at the beginning of the week to spend time with Clarence Anthony, who's the head of the National League of Cities, and he said something I thought that sort of summarized a little bit what you guys experienced, and then I want to dig a little deeper. He said, cities are unifying places. They put people over potholes. They can't let politics get in the way. We're living in a world of cities where the thinking begins with human thriving, where we have one vision, one plan that will force the world to sit up and see local leadership for what it can achieve. And I wanted to get a sense of from the two of you if that was your same read from the fellowship, if you said in the film that you found more unifying elements than dividing ones, but we already teased out in our early discussions, you know, there's major differences between how US cities run and German cities run, starting with public financing, starting with, you know, how you do resource distribution, particularly on issues of housing. So what surprised you in going around Germany and in putting that in context? What surprised you most about what you learned while you were together?
So I'm happy to start. Thank you, and thank you to both the PPI and Das Positive Zentrum for having us. This was a really exceptional experience. I would say cities at their best are that, but go to a local community board meeting about how to repair and rehabilitate NYCHA, New York City public housing, that has not been invested in for 40 years. And you'll hear that there's no alignment, there's no unison, there's a real disconnect between what affordability looks like, what repairs should look like. And I think, because I can only speak as an American who came through Germany, and what I was most surprised by was the nature of the conversation around what housing success looks like. Mm-hmm. We met with the secretary for, I believe it's the state of Berlin's kind of committee on housing, and they walked us through the municipal housing structure and how there was a concept of municipal housing entities that have to compete with one another, that have the ability to build below market and market rate housing that can cross-subsidize the latter. And that is a dramatic, revolutionary idea in the US. Mixing market rate and below income housing has been something that we've really, really struggled to do. And it means that we're not able to build as much. It means we don't have the same resources. We don't have the same toolkit that the cities and the entities building housing in Germany do. So that was something that really surprised me coming here, was just how different the definition of something like social housing is. And it's something I've tried to come out of this fellowship and really take into my work. I was at the Housing Authority when we started. I'm now at M Squared doing mixed income sustainable housing investment. So,
well, I want to hear more about like how that then actually works in practice. Because when I was working at the city of New York in 2009, we were just discussing this very weird principle that you would build different entrances for different income housing in one building, right? And boy, are we glad that got buried. But maybe it didn't. Maybe it took on a new life, Julian. You can tell us about it. But anyway, what surprised you most about fellowship and that experience that you all had together?
Yeah. So before we start into that, and I hate to dodge your question, I know you're the moderator and it's probably annoys you. I just want to go back to something you started with in that quote about people over potholes and people over politics. That first half of that is right. I do think cities, in actuality, in practice, and in principle, put people over potholes and want to make sure that people are moving through cities well, people are comfortable in their cities, people are safe in their cities. But when it comes to the politics, we certainly do not put our people in front of our politics. That is something that I think is a unifying thing that I saw throughout both cities, both countries, and all 6 cities we visited. There is a penchant for folks in the public sector, and as someone who's worked in the public sector, the private sector, I can be completely and totally objective about this, but there is a penchant to want to serve 2 masters in a sense. There's this desire to make sure that the economic interests that are invested in cities remain. You see this a lot in the US where cities and states fight over big companies, and they, Amazon had this big fight with New York City to get big tax breaks to come there. You see that a lot. But that comes at the expense of the people who live in these cities, who are invested in these cities. I think Richard said it in the video, the people who remained in the trenches when cities had their massive downturn. And now when cities are being revitalized, these are the same people being pushed out, and often are being pushed out to lower quality, in the US at least, lower quality old suburban neighborhoods that are being abandoned and left behind by those same people who had, the white flighters who had left cities and abandoned cities in the 70s, 80s, and 90s that are returning to come back to those buildings that had good bones, but they just had no money and no investment. So I think that when we start to really evaluate cities and how cities operate, we really need to make sure that there's a balance and an alignment between the public sector's interests and the interests of the people. And the private sector, I work there, I love it. The private sector is great for a number of reasons, but they should not be the primary driver of what our outcomes in cities and in our states are.
We'll talk a little bit about how we get that balance right in the public-private partnership component, or what you saw and what you learned being together as sort of models that you think might be applicable or could be stripped down and then scaled up in different environments, because both of you are in the game of housing. But Julian, just a little bit, what was in traveling around, what was the thing that you found most surprising or most challenging even that you were seeing in other cities, where you said, look, this is, the political system, the context is such that it couldn't work in the United States, or vice versa. Look, stripped down to the bones, this is a concept we might think about introducing at local level.
Yeah, there was a lot of praise for it in this video, which you saw for Leipzig. And I'm not just saying it because we have a representative from Leipzig here. I think
we'll bring Ulrich into the conversation, then he can talk all about how great Leipzig is.
I do think that the concept that we heard, and in our group, we were the network governance and democracy group. So we were always thinking of these ideas of power and how power is distributed across cities and in stakeholder groups. And when they described to us the decisions that were made early on, when Leipzig did not have its upswing and be, to this cool hip city that people want to come to, they had an opportunity to go in the direction that many cities in Germany and in the US did, where they, shed some of their available inventory that was affordable for, the working class, the artists, the musicians, the folks who want to live in a city, and they didn't. They kept it. They kept their cultural side, and that allowed them to then be able to attract, the new folks who were coming up of age that wanted to live somewhere that they could afford, but also want to live somewhere that was accommodating to their lifestyle. That to me was a revolutionary concept. Most cities did not do that. Chicago eradicated its housing sector and their public housing sector. So much so that when they knocked down public housing, a lot of the folks who ended up living there dispersed across the city, and then the city ends up spending more in subsidizing someone else as a landlord instead of them providing quality housing. New York City didn't do that to that extent. They
had that in the 80s, then everything, and then you had the whole, right.
Yeah, so we had a certain administration that started to shed some of its assets. I do think that the one thing that that stuck out, and the one thing that I think is translatable, is you, as a city, as a state, you have to find your direction and the definition of who you are.
Yeah, a mission statement.
Your mission statement, your guiding principle, your ethos as a city. And then after that, you fight like hell to maintain that vision of what it is. You come back to the drawing board, you make sure that whatever direction you're going in, if you veered, you steer back to it, but you never lose sight of who you are there. because that is the only thing that actually helps you get to where you want to be.
Do you feel, okay, just because this is so fascinating, because my whole Eisenhower Fellowship was dedicated to this idea. Do you feel that in the transatlantic space, are there places that have recognized that? So Providence, Rhode Island did a little bit of what I'm hearing, what Leipzig did. They did that. Mayor Cianci, very complicated guy. We all know who know him.
Understatement.
Yeah, but nice pasta sauce. Brought arts back to the heart of the city, the industrial part of the city that the city had left because he was trying to fill every population and pull population from New York, right? This whole idea now. So, but in Colombia, the Colombian cities, for instance, it's a matter of like refinding their resilience, made that a very strong part of their narrative, right? And so when you go and experience Colombian public transportation, sort of the modern incarnation of the Transmilenio, if you go to places like Cali, you know, there it's about how you understand your public transportation, keep it clean, because that is what connects all of you to one another. And the mission is that if you care for your public transportation, the city will care for you. There's a very interesting subcomponent of that mission. In looking at American cities and German cities, did you feel like some cities had that sort of brand and ethos where you're like, okay, this has been clearly understood?
Yeah, I'd say that I think Austin tops the list for the U.S. of the cities we visited. I felt I'm sorry if there's anyone from Denver here. I felt really disappointed in Denver. I felt like Denver, when I first visited, had that ethos, that direction, that vision, and completely lost sight of it in the sense that, you know, we walked through, Neil and I actually walked through one morning just to walk around Denver before the day got started. And we saw so many tent cities. And we thought to ourselves, how in this city that's doing this well, do you have this many people on the street? Many men who actually then were getting up, getting ready to go to work. So they were working, but still had no home to go to. And where they had their tent cities, and the organization that we met with while we were in Denver talked about it. One of these organizations was tasked with partnering with the owners of parking lots to allow people to put up tent cities in revolving areas to keep their tent cities going, so people can stay somewhere for months at a time in a parking lot that you have just sitting there.
So that's not really solving the problem at all. Because then, of course, you know, we all know in homeless populations, there are big mental health issues. Oftentimes there's other inequality issues. You know, the root sources of a lot of those problems need to be sought elsewhere. And generally we think in terms of proximity to the actual human, that cities would be the ones who can then engage, you know, start with the human thriving component. Ian, you've seen a lot. Now you're looking at where can we invest to bring that public-private partnership to bear, because you've seen it from the other side. Who's doing that kind of work, that spotting of possibilities and the vetting and application of private money in solving those kind of interconnected problems well, or not well?
I would say there's two components that have to be in place, and one is committed public entities. So our work, mixed income housing, is almost not possible if there's not some public program for us to work with.
Right.
If there's not, a great example is Seattle, or the state of Washington and Seattle has their own application of this. It's called the Multi-Family Tax Exemption Program. It's a requirement for some level of affordability that provides a tax exemption. And that enables us to step in with a local development partner and work on the affordability program. And we actually have, the founder of the fund I work for, Alicia Glenn, used to be the deputy mayor for New York City and really championed mixed income housing. And so she went and raised capital. And it's one of the first funds ever that is traditional private equity, but looking for the opportunity to take the public's aim and move further. So it gives us the opportunity to step in and say, great, let's do not 20, but 25% affordability. Let's do not 20% at 80% of the area median income, but at 50% of the area median income. And if there wasn't that existing program in place, that conversation is hard to happen. It's hard to have that conversation. So it's hard to go to, we've actually tried in Austin and asking a developer to actually, in a public-private partnership with the city, create additional layers of affordability, but the programs haven't been there. So I'd say the first critical step is there has to be a willing and devoted public partner. And then you need a different kind of private sector involvement. That's a little bit what it's been 7 months, so I'm hoping that's what this is building towards a partner that is working with public institutions and public entities and not against them or not taking advantage of them. But I don't know if that answers.
So before I bring Ulrich up into this discussion, we talk about how this looks from the depth of the perspective of the city. I want to, just reflect on these 3 years that you have been together, because both in terms of urban development, but just in terms of the world. We had a major pandemic that challenged pretty much everything that we believed, and we talked about in our mainstay session. We used to think that density by and large, if managed correctly, is a good thing. Suddenly density meant death. We're in the midst of 2 critical transitions, the climate transition for cities. Nothing felt more vivid, I think, for all of us who live in urban surround than this summer, where you had both extreme water and extreme drought affect, the way that we operate in our cities, extreme heat. You have now chief heat officers at a number of places, and then you have people like Henk Ovink in the Netherlands, who's a special envoy for water. The fact that we even need these opportunities now. Somebody talked about, of course, the Trump administration pulling the plug out of the transatlantic relationship, but the Trump administration also pulled the plug out of relationships between cities and Washington. And some of that's still going on. We see migrants being shipped to other cities, So, this has been, and now, of course, this cataclysmic war in Ukraine that's really gone straight for cities. Cities were always the prizes of warfare, and now they're the direct target of warfare, because just attacking a city is attacking its history, it's attacking its civic infrastructure. 34 mayors captured and kidnapped. The idea is that if you get to a city, you demoralize, you deracinate, you rename, you deculturize a city. And you were all in the midst of this enormous bubble of change. As we think about urban thriving, what are your hopes? You're, sort of the next gen. Looking at this cauldron of difficulty we have, and then still sort of making the case for cities as the next best hope. What are your hopes for the next 5 or 10 years in the urban landscape, Ian?
It's really rare to be part of something, a fellowship like this that lasts for 3 years. And I was just remarking how strident or how starkly different the conversations happening in Berlin now are from just a year ago when we were here.
Right.
We were not talking about Sweden. We were not talking about Italy. We were not talking about Ukraine a year ago.
Yeah.
And for me, it just reminds me how little time we have for each of these crises.
Right.
It's not like those issues have been solved. It's not like the climate crisis we talked about last October has been solved, and there are just new nuances to it. So I think my hope is really, and it's within the working paper I worked on with my group, it's that we understand that the messaging is important, but the action has to be there and the action has to follow, and that we can all look at these crises and respond with action from both the public and the private sector in a way that is complementary, building alliances. And I just have to share this anecdote from our trip to Austin, because it was fascinating. We met with a group called Rethink 35 because they are expanding a highway in the middle of Austin. And the city mayor hasn't commented on it, won't comment on it. And I had not seen our group so animated as this meeting, learning that Austin, who was talking to us about their green policy, was just going to allow an expansion of a highway, which granted is state authority. But and right after that, we met with representatives from the city who are working on the city's climate equity plan and had been working on it for 3 years, had a beautiful plan, had a beautiful conversation about equity, yet they were allowing a highway to be expanded into a historically underinvested neighborhood. And I think my hope for the future is that highway expansions are a great manifestation or metaphor for this, but that those highway expansions won't be happening, that we can actually reverse course, that we can actually take action towards implementing the messaging and not just clarify the messaging more.
Julian, message of hope.
Message of hope. I believe there's an author, Blazer, wrote a book, Triumph of the City. And I think in there stated that cities are the greatest human invention, right? It's the one thing that we have actually put together that serves to benefit all of us all the time. And we should treat them as such. Cities are prized treasures. There are reasons why we can think of, I tell you, think of a great city and things start to pop into your head for all sorts of reasons. And there's a purpose behind that. And it's because we have dumped our culture and our ideas in there. We've dumped our innovations there. And I say dumped as if it's a bad thing, but realistically, people come there with their hopes and their dreams. This is the thing that I said in the opening question that we were supposed to submit to Depazed about what do we think when we think of cities? And I think of the hopes and dreams that people come to the cities with. I grew up in New York. I grew up in Soundview in the Bronx, and you can Google that when you get home later, and you can see whatever the Bronx was in the 80s and 90s when I was growing up. But I will say that, you know, coming from an immigrant family, the people who I grew up with, they all came there. You deposited yourself into this really toxic situation, but you still had your hopes and your dreams and your idea that, you know what, this city is going to be what makes me or breaks me, and I'm going to make sure I succeed. We need to continue to reinvest in cities as if we thought of them as engines for people's growth and not just a place that a lot of people live in, which is, I think, the prevailing idea of when we think of cities. There's crime, there's a lot of people, it's crowded, there's traffic. Sure, yes. And this is a place where people grow and see themselves transform into new people. So without New York City, I would, you know, I'm a broken human because of New York City, and I'm a well-adjusted human because of New York City, and I owe cities so much for my identity, and I think a lot of people feel the same way too.
All right, that was a beautiful statement to end this segment on. I'm going to just ask Ulrich Hanning to join us up here. To many of you in this room, a very familiar face. He's the deputy mayor for general services at the city of Leipzig, which got a lot of praise in this video, frankly. And speaking of cities that have undergone numerous changes, not least historically, as we look back on our German history. But what I loved is Zinaida's in the room, this idea that to allow for change in a plan for Leipzig, in an Agenda 2030, you have to leave space. Well, as you just heard this whole idea of cities can make you or break you, or they need to shift. How do you think about this idea of placemaking and space making in the Leipzig context?
Well, first of all, thanks for the invitation and congratulations to everyone who makes this platform possible. I think this has been, I mean, I've been a speaker at your dinner at Leipzig, but I am now only starting to measure what you've been put together here. I mean, this is like a life-changing, I mean, not to compare with the Bronx in the 80s, but, sort of a life-influencing experience for many people. And I think this is truly investment into minds and hearts and human connections that we see. And so this is great that we have this in the transatlantic space. Well, the question on what is the Leipzig experience of growth, I mean, has been by design. The city lost 100,000 jobs within 2 years. It lost 80,000 people within about 10 years after that sort of shock of unification, and it has been sort of rebuilding since. And so that is the sort of the story that we looked at, but it's nothing. It's no secret sauce. It's just basically now stick to your zoning plan. You know, that's
we heard that. So they got that. They clearly.
That's what I.
Yeah.
And also a commitment on part of city leadership, and also close work between city council, the political leaders at the time, alliance across parties, which not the same party fragmentation that we had in other cities. And so that's a truly sort of Wundertisch type round table post-transition democratic history that I think was transitioned into also political culture in city council, and that helped the different mayors to let the administration work with city council in a way that enabled them to have long-term plans instead of short-term political gains of who gets what for what sort of district or so. And so I think that is some of the Leipzig experience. And of course now our politics gets more fragmented, it gets more conflictual. If you have our current conflicts between bikers and car owners, of course there were no shortages of conflict. So yeah, that's sort of my the view on sort of keeping space, but I think the space was also not a democratic or a deliberate decision of the city. It was more by it was brought to us by economic decline.
Mm-hmm.
It was brought to us with 25% unemployment.
Right.
So it's not that, oh, let's create some space. It's
let's put a park.
So anyway, so yeah.
Yeah. But then still, I mean, you just described a little bit how you have to, you have to stick to your guns in planning, but then you also have to, set and reset priorities. And we just talked about these last 3 years that asked some major questions of us in terms of what constitutes functional urban life. So, I mean, I'm assuming also as part of that space is also space and decision making and ability to renegotiate where you need to. Can you give us an example of, in this layer cake of crises that we lived through and are living through, how that manifested in City Hall?
Well, a layer cake of crises. This is interesting. I mean, we've also had as you refer to the relationship now also with the city of Kiev. I mean, city of Kiev has been our oldest city, sister city. We just last year celebrated 60 years of partnership, and through four political systems. And always the two cities remaining the two cities, but and so this is something that has helped us now in the situation, with the war in Ukraine, to really mobilize, and we've mobilized in City Council a special budget of 11 million euros, and we also provided 3 million euros of aid to Kiev. Where I was recently on the panel with our federal development minister, who proudly said that, oh, now she has found 3 million for intercity cooperation between Germany and Ukraine, and said, well, this is what we spend on a sort of
tiny
little poor. I mean, we're just poor Leipzig. We're not rich Hamburg, So that's something where we, where the question that you put out in the beginning, what are the alliances? What are the platforms that enable us to act in a this is one of the those platforms, and I very much like what Almut was saying on the the European Union providing a platform also for our line staff to experience international cooperation. It's all nice that we sit here. It's all nice that the head of the international offices go and visit each other. If it doesn't become palpable for sort of a housing officer or for a city planner or for a junior program manager in the youth department, international connectedness is lofty stuff. So I think this is where these EU programs provide a great platform, because they help us bring international experiences, and may just be with the European sister city in the framework of a European program, to junior staff and to middle management staff and to our city councilors, because we can't fly our city councilors to Chicago so easily. But we can have them take a train ride to Lyon. So this is where it becomes meaningful, and the whole, I mean, it's also hopefully a bulwark against what we discuss here, an authoritarian wave that says, okay, whatever, Hungary first, America first, whatever first, and I don't care about my neighbors. And so I think this is where it becomes part of a broader political agenda and the fight for liberal democracy.
I think this particular piece about city managers and giving them the kind of resources, tools. You guys talked about models and public-private partnerships, kind of what works. I think that's something that I heard it's just part of the City and State Diplomacy Task Force to put an office of city and state diplomacy in the U.S. State Department. And the number one thing we heard, or at least was effectively what you said, except for in a more complaining tone, is that if you ask city managers, could they also take on all these international roles, or could they also carry this water for the national government, or could they? And they said no. Because they're busy taking the trash out, fixing the potholes, engaging with the public, figuring out the housing dilemma, and if, quote unquote, from that collaboration doesn't come additional resources or additional how to, or where to, or with what resource, with what financial resources, then it quickly, international connections can also become a burden unless they're done in a way that, or, the responsibility to do that, unless they're done in a really practical way. So, you all three have now seen how some of that real practical exchange works. I mean, there's always ideas you can hook onto, but maybe starting with Ian, then moving down to Ulrich, what is the most practical thing that you saw over the last, 3 years of your fellowship where you're like, that's it, that's something that we can almost immediately, or I can take home almost immediately as a practical, I can pare this down or rescale or rethink it, but that's a resource?
When we tried to implement the initial housing plan, it was in this top-down way that got no buy-in. And you're in this tough place because residents have apartments that if they were privately managed, the Department of Buildings would not allow them to exist. And you both have very limited solutions from what capital can actually come to the table, and you can't accept the status quo. And there's really it always felt like really a no-win situation. And it was especially no win because no matter what you chose, it was top down and residents wouldn't accept it. It was a failure from the start in their eyes. And something we'd been kicking around was how the participatory process would and should look like. And this was when I was at the Housing Authority. And when we went on our trip and I met with different folks in the housing infrastructure you have here, there was just a reality of tenant participation in ownership and management and decision-making. And all of this has led into, I went back and I really started championing a different model where we have to have a vote, and we're actually working on these rules, or my former colleagues are working on these rules right now. There has to be, at the beginning of this process of every housing campus, a moment where you talk to them, say, these are the options. You need to be at the table making a decision to actually have buy-in, not just for the implementation, but for how we adjudicate success. So that was just tenant buy-in, having them as part of the process, and having almost shared mutual responsibility really was something I took from our trip to Germany.
How about you, Julian?
Yeah, I would say that I know we're short on time, so I'll try to be brief. I think something that we picked up in Chicago, I took back immediately to my role in New York, and it was this very small idea of listening to activists and advocates in spaces. We did this walking tour of this transit-oriented development that's happening, and this remodeling of a side of Chicago that took in heavy consideration what people on the ground actually had to say. And I know it sounds like a no-brainer. You should listen to the folks who are on the ground dealing with issues every day. But it wasn't just listening to them, it was them also making a conscious decision to be an active stakeholder in all the political processes. It was more than just railing against an administration from outside. It was looking for ways to actually inject yourself into the broader policy making and decision making system and structure. So in New York, what we did, we had an incoming administration, the Adams administration, and what we did was we sought ways to actually be part of that. We joined the transition committee. We injected ourselves into the housing plan in ways that actually allowed us to better reflect both the priorities we had, but also that of the people who are within our stakeholder group.
Well, Leipzig is one of the cities in Germany next to Hamburg, next to Dortmund, Mannheim, Düsseldorf, that are the cities that are sort of most active on the international stage. Are there examples that you have looked and seen in the international context that you have found a way of applying in Leipzig, and why?
Well, I think it's good to have these city-to-city networks, and we're very active in Eurocities, as Almut has also said. That's sort of our framework and our sort of main line, and also with the Leipzig Charta, with the central EU policy document that we've sort of tried to follow and try to implement and so on. But I think the key transatlantic takeaway for me, and of course, unfortunately, I wasn't able to go on those trips. I was just able to have dinner with you in Leipzig. But the key transatlantic takeaway for me is always the role of capturing value through property taxes. And this is something that is completely underdeveloped in Germany, where we find multiple ways of working around and having private developers co-pay whatever they do. And sort of that's something where we need to have a very much more, and of course we're now budging our whole introduction of a reformed property tax in Germany at the moment through sort of non-competing and non-coordinated online systems. But if we eventually get it right, we need to continue that conversation of how we tax property locally and how we also, as city governments, participate in the increasing value of property, and then of course share it also for local social infrastructure to avoid sort of these displacement effects that we've discussed. And so that's for me the key transatlantic takeaway that we need to still have on the taxation side. And this is the former Ministry of Finance official in me that comes through. But the question of where do we see the biggest collaboration pieces has really been for Leipzig, our partners with the city of Gdansk, with unfortunately our dear colleague Pavel Adamovich, who was murdered. And I think he's been a great partner for us in developing our history of democracy and our the Solidarity Center in Gdansk, and also the sort of tradition of the peaceful transition in Leipzig, but also now the city partnership with Kiev, which is the most important right now. And so, but we continue to remain committed to international exchange, and of course, it's also a deep feeling of gratitude to being open to the world and being sort of reconnecting to that Leipzig tradition of openness.
I think the new mayor of Gdansk, who I also just saw in Amsterdam, is very engaged in continuing that and continuing engagement in, the legacy of the transition and what it then means to play it forward vis-a-vis the conflict in Ukraine. This was a real deep dive into questions of housing and equity and what works and what doesn't work. And I'm particularly grateful to this panel for not sugarcoating it, for pinpointing, where the work remains, because yes, the 3 years may have come to a conclusion, and it was Almut and I really enjoyed being on the advisory board for this fellowship and getting to see all of your biographies before we helped select you. So it's really a pleasure to be in the room with everybody's actually animated faces. But the work remains. But I think what is you've heard from these three gentlemen and from our main stage program is that principally it takes committed individuals to want to make a difference every day. So thanks to the three of you, thanks to all of you, bon voyage, and thank you for everything that you've done over these last 3 years.